Welcome back. We'll start now. Our next speaker is Claire Arnold-Baker.
There we are. Hopefully, somebody said just recently that you will all be able to stay awake after lunch, that all of this wonderful lunch that we've just had is not going to send you off to sleep. So today I'm going to be talking about the maternal power of connection as a way of building bridges. So I just want to say how wonderful it is to be here today in Istanbul. It's my first time, so this is very exciting. This is a little bit about me. I'm the principal at NSPC. I'm also the course leader of the DC Psych program, and I specialize in working with mothers, and that's the subject of my research. And I've also written and co-authored and co-edited some books as well. So really what I want to kind of be talking about today is our first relationship, the relationship that we have between a baby and its mother. And I just wanted to kind of introduce this. Well, first of all, I just want to make a point about, I'm using the word maternal, but I don't want it to be just thought primarily about motherhood or mothers, although obviously a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is about mothers. But I'm seeing maternal as a kind of a more genderless role. And I think we could argue that us therapists are actually working in a very maternal way. So that's the first kind of caveat that I wanted to say. And the second one is that if you've heard me speak before, you might see some of those ideas already. So I apologize for that, but I'm also introducing some new ideas as well. So I wanted to start off by talking about my experience of becoming a mother. I'm going to spare you the gory details, but really I want to kind of talk about this moment of meeting my daughter for the first time. And it didn't happen straight away. We ended up having to stay in hospital for 4 days after the birth because she developed jaundice. And those first couple of days was just kind of like a very surreal experience. I was walking around in a sort of a state of shell shock, not quite sure what had just happened to me, what was happening to me. It was very noisy in the ward. I hadn't slept for days. But then there was on the second evening, I put my daughter down in her Perspex hospital crib and sat down on the bed. And we had a moment where she looked at me and I looked at her. And there was just something very profound in that moment where we just connected in a way of just seeing each other and really trying to reach out. And I know that a lot of people might say to me, well, babies can't see anything, you know, you're just like a fuzzy blob to them. Their eyes haven't kind of quite worked. But I would dispute that because I really felt in that moment that she really looked at me and it was a look of understanding and connection. And the same went for me as well. And when I think back about it, I kind of have this idea that actually everything went quiet in that moment. I didn't hear any of the other babies or the other noise in the ward. It was just, we were in that moment. I don't think it lasts very long, you know, maybe maximum 5 minutes, but it stayed with me. And my daughter is now 18, doing her A-levels. So this is something that's kind of really kept with me all of that time. And so, of course, for me, it felt very much like what Buber would describe as an I-thou relationship. he talks about, as I'm sure a lot of you already know, so I'm just going to kind of repeat this, that we have two modes of relating. We can either relate in an I-it way, where we're just trying to keep the focus on ourselves and our own understanding. And in that way, we kind of treat the other as an object. We're kind of trying to find information out that is relevant to who we are and our own understanding, rather than really trying to connect with the other person. So I-thou relating is a very different kind of way of relating, and it's about meeting the other in this open and receptive manner, so that understanding is then co-created in that moment. And if you've read Buber, you'll recognize his anecdote where he talks about meeting a horse. You know, he had this very good relationship with his horse, and they had a moment of kind of meeting, very much in the way that I've just described about my meeting my daughter. And so he talks about an I-thou, that relationship, as a way where the boundary between the self and the other becomes really hazy, and that it becomes sort of moments where you're just very present in the moment. You're not really thinking about what's happening around you, or even really thinking about what you're doing. You're just in that moment of connection and being with the other person. And so I-thou relationships are really about trying to reach out to the other person and trying to connect to their essence and kind of creating some kind of understanding together. And I suppose really we could argue that that's very much what we do in existential therapy as well. We're trying to reach out to the other person and really understand them in that way. So the other part that was really interesting in Buber's work is that he believed that babies have an inbuilt I-thou, so that they are drawn to creating connections with other people, that they're particularly drawn to connecting with faces. And some recent research by Camps et al. Said that actually, rather than how we used to think about early, baby child development, is that babies are born with this tabula rasa, this blank slate, that there's kind of nothing going on, and then through experience something gets built. He believed that actually there's this hardwiring involved in how babies are going to connect to people and faces. And when we kind of think about that type of relationship, that I-thou relationship, Frankl kind of brought in another element when he said that love is the only way to grasp another human being in the innermost core of his personality. No one can become fully aware of the very essence of another human unless he loves him. So for Frankl, he's really kind of taking this idea of an I-thou relationship, of that kind of real connection, and saying that this is about love, that we can only really establish that kind of deep connection if we feel love for them. And so when we think about maternal or paternal love, we can start thinking about it in terms of this idea of the unconditional love. So this comes from Fromm's work, from his book, The Art of Loving. And he sees that maternal and paternal love is unconditional. It's unequal. And there's something about, what parents do in terms of how they want to respond to a baby. So Fromm says, there is nothing I have to do in order to be loved. Mother's love is unconditional. And of course, this is wonderful in some ways if you're getting that unconditional love. Obviously, if you're not able to receive or the mother's not able to give unconditional love to their child, then there's nowhere for the child to go in order to kind of to get that. But there is something about that unconditional nature and its inequality. Now, when I was doing my research, one of my participants kind of really talks about this element. And she said, it shows the bond that, and that she recognizes me. She knows who I am, and that when she saw me again, you know, sharp intake of breath, I want you straight away, which is fantastic. And again, that's when you realize that is so worthwhile. It makes it all worthwhile when you just have that and you have that sort of reaction to her. So a lot of my participants and a lot of my clients that I have talk about how hard it is in those first early months to be able to connect with their baby when it's such an unequal relationship. They're not getting anything back. You know, babies don't really start smiling until about 3 months. So there's a lot of this kind of unconditional love is needed to be able to make those connections with their babies, because they're not doing it in this kind of reciprocal way. Obviously, when the baby grows and develops and get older and they become more responsive, then there feels more reciprocity. So in those first months, it's quite hard. The baby's having to, you know, mother's having to try and reach out to their baby. And Fromm goes on to talk about that there are two aspects of unconditional love. And the first one is around meeting the child's needs. So there is an element of really having to go out and meet their needs. And I think this is really being kind of caught up in the social discourse around mothering, particularly around this ideas around the maternal myth, the mother myth, or the perfect mother, that somehow our needs as mothers have to be put one side and the baby's needs have to take priority. And of course they do at the beginning. You know, we have a vulnerable baby who can't, you know, fulfill its own needs. So we have to do that for them. But I think it adds sometimes a bit of a pressure. So there's an element of having to meet the baby's needs, which we do that unconditionally. But there's also a part that hasn't really been taken up by, you know, some mainstream discourse, which is about instilling in the child a love for living. This is quite a big thing, isn't it? You know, to actually think that we have to do that. You know, first of all, I guess we have to feel that love for living ourselves. It's, you know, and I wonder whether women who struggle postnatally with postnatal depression or birth trauma, for example, actually feel that they're able to do that. But there is something about how they're, you know, sort of trying to give the child this love for life and creativity, and also enabling them to make that separation. And so that, you know, when they get to 18, they're able to leave home and go out into the world. And so there's something there about these two parts that really remind me of Heidegger's ideas about leaping in and leaping ahead. So obviously the first one, meeting the child's needs, is very much about leaping in. We know we leap in for the child, we do what they need us to do, and we're there, we kind of take control of the situation maybe. And then the second is very much about leaping ahead, and it's about giving that control back to the child so that they can discover what life is about for themselves and that love that they for life. So when we kind of start thinking about connection, it starts off in a very embodied way. So through the pregnancy, the mother is connected with her baby in an embodied way. And there's a real kind of ambiguity about what's the baby, what's me, and sort of like this kind of interconnection of the two bodies. And Merleau-Ponty talks about inter-embodied, which is an anonymous, collectively and undifferentiated undifferentiated group life. So there's kind of like this disconnect between mother and baby in terms of that kind of very embodied way. And then after the birth, we're now calling that the fourth trimester, and seeing that actually it's still a very embodied experience. You know, the baby needs to be held. There's an sort of like an ambiguity again. You know, the mother is feeding. There's lots of bodily connections. And again, it kind of ties in with Merleau-Ponty's ideas of reversibility, you know, where we're when we touch and we are touched in the same moment. So to start off with, this is how we communicate with our babies, is through the body. There's no words, there's no language. And again, this can be a really difficult thing for mothers who, you know, quite often will say to me, I don't know what they want. You know, they're crying and I've tried everything and I just don't know what I need to do, what they need. And so we have to learn this kind of reading of this new embodied way. So really interestingly, some neuroimaging research has looked at how, you know, despite what I just said about how mothers really need that kind of positive feedback to make it feel worthwhile, actually mothers respond a lot more strongly to their baby's distress than when they're smiling, and that the distress activates this need to respond. So we're better at responding in a crisis to other people than we are responding in this everyday way of being. And again, this will be very much down to a sort of survival instinct that the mothers are kind of hooked into when their babies are born. So it's all very well to think about responding, but we have to actually know when to respond or how to respond. So there has to be this idea of maternal attunement, which is very much what Naomi Stadland has been writing about in her book, What Mothers Do, especially when it looks like nothing. She talks about how, you know, it looks like you're just sitting around all day. And this is quite often what my clients will say to me. You know, they'll say, well, my husband comes home and says, well, what have you been doing all day? And they say, well, I've been looking after the baby. And from all intents and purposes, it looks like they've just been sat down, you know, having a nice relaxing time with their baby. But actually, what's happening is this emotional and bodily connection, which doesn't have any words. And because there are no words, then we think it doesn't happen. You know, if we don't have this language, then it feels that there's nothing that's actually been shared. But what's actually happening is that the mothers are completely tuned in to what's going on for the baby, what the baby wants, how they respond, and are then modifying their responses in tune with that. I kind of think about it in terms of like sort of a mass parent, you know, baby observation study that every parent goes through, you know, that in those first moments, you know, the baby becomes this thing to study and to try and understand. So maternal attunement involves listening, and I know we've already talked about listening quite a bit already today. And Rossiter talks about intensive listening. Listening involves a constant tuning in to the baby's needs, preferences, dislikes, and responses. And Levin talks about that mothers go into this mode of expert listening, which requires openness, receptiveness, and attentiveness. So it's really important to think about this kind of listening that we're talking about. And again, as already been said this morning, is it really like what we're doing in therapy, isn't it? This active listening that we're doing in this open and receptive way. And the thing about parents is that they don't just stop listening. You know, certainly at the beginning, when they're trying to understand their babies and what their baby needs, it's a kind of continual listening. And even if they can't get the message straight away. They don't give up. They just keep trying and trying different things and keeping that connection going. So another of my participants said, early ideas about the kind of mother you'll be are reversed as you are learning about him. People say that you know your child best, but you haven't known them for that long, and their communication is limited, so you're just finding out. But sometimes you don't feel like you know them at all. Yet how you deal with them is a lot more subconscious. You actually know them quite well. What they prefer, you learn it together, but you don't consciously acknowledge to yourself what you have learned. Only looking back do you realize how much you have learned and how you have dealt with things together. So I think that really kind of, again, sort of echoes some of the work that Naomi Stadlin's been doing about this, sort of not unconscious, but out of awareness, how the communication is happening. And I had an interesting experience when I went to visit my cousin after her baby had been born, and she's left-handed. And I picked up a baby and I popped the baby on my hip in the way that I used to with my babies. And the baby was looking over there. And I was thinking, well, this is really weird. Why isn't this baby looking at me? And then I was realizing, well, I've got him on the wrong hip. He's used to the other hip. So if I put him on this hip, then he started looking at me, because obviously there was that kind of connection between him and his mother. So this is also important to realize that it's not about the mother responding to the baby, it's also co-created. It's the baby, influencing the mother as well, and vice versa. So here we are, maternal bridge building. This is what parents are doing. They're reaching out, trying to make a connection, building a bridge to another person. And this involves creating space. So when we're talking about becoming a mother, and matrescence has got a revival at the moment in terms of trying to just encapsulate this period of new motherhood, it requires tremendous shifts, both physically and emotionally and psychologically. There's some recent neurophysiological research which mapped the brains of pregnant and postnatal mothers to show the amount of neuroplasticity that happens in the maternal brain. And I'm sure you've all heard of this kind of this idea of the mummy brain, where you kind of forget everything and you're, there's something around there that your brain actually changes. And also, interestingly, it's not just the mother's brain that changes, the father's brain also changes, maybe not to the same extent, but there is that change. So there's something that happens when we start to respond and really kind of connect out with other people, that changes how we think and how we relate, and actually changes our brain. So I think the spatial dimension is rather overlooked, because it's not just about mothers creating spaces in their bodies, it's also about them creating spaces in their lives as well to encompass this new baby. Naomi Stadlin talks about heart room. She says that the mothers go through a slowing down process, which opens up attentiveness and attunement. So to be able to really listen to somebody, you need to be slow. You need to take time to really open things up and be receptive. Christopher says something similar: rather slow, difficult, and delightful process of becoming attentive, tender, and self-effacing. So this is really around this kind of, in order to be able to connect with people, we need to be slow and we need to listen. Stadlin's idea of heart room really comes from Kierkegaard's idea of upbuilding. And she says that if a mother opens up real heart room for her child, it does not seem possible to fold it away again. And I think this is what was shown in my research, that mothers moved into a mode of being towards relating, that there was a real shift in how they related, and they started seeing that they were being different with their own mother, their partner, but also other people. So I had one participant say to me, that she would be quite irritated with people normally. And, she sort of saw herself as being this quite hard person who was, sort of really sort of sure of herself and didn't have time for other people. And that suddenly, with the birth of her baby, she started to become more understanding. So that this kind of mode of relating wasn't just towards her baby, that it kind of opened something up, that she was able to access that when in her relationships with other people too. So when we talk about existential space, we're talking about creating a space to incorporate the baby. So physically, bodily changes need to be made. Socially, it's about creating a home and accommodating the needs, moving from the public to a private realm. Personally, it's about creating heartroom and creating a new sense of identity. And then spiritually, it's about creating a new sense of purpose and priority. So a lot of the work that I've been doing is around this idea of an existential crisis that happens in motherhood, and that actually by creating existential space, when we're having to change the spatial dimension of our lives to incorporate a baby, it can lead to an existential crisis. Because women are impacted on all four dimensions of their existence. So there's nowhere that they feel that things have not changed. Everything has changed. Their bodies have changed, their social relationships, their position in society has changed, their relationships with other people have changed, how they think about themselves has changed, their identity has changed, and their priorities in life have changed. Their values and beliefs suddenly come into sharp focus, and they are also confronted by existential themes as well. So here we can see, most interestingly, I think, in the physical dimension, is actually the confrontation with temporality that is the most interesting. Our sense of time changes. So mothers kind of report just being completely in the present moment. In the immediate past, what's just happened, and the immediate future, what's just about to happen. So when you think about, sometimes new mums will say, oh, this is never going to change. It's going to be like this forever, if their babies are not sleeping through the night. And they can't possibly project themselves into 10 years, 20 years, when their children will all be sleeping through the night at that point, because they're very much stuck in that present moment. Birth also brings death with it. In that moment of birth, we're also confronted by mortality. Embodiment, changes in embodiment, changes in our being towards, and also, importantly, responsibility and this sense of this unknown. So women are moving from where they feel confident and competent in this known world into this unknown world where they feel completely, sort of at sea. They don't feel like they know what they're doing. So an existential crisis, I'm taking the word crisis from the Greek, which means to decide or to choose. So motherhood is a time where everything has to be chosen. Birth involves a thoroughness both for the baby and for the mother as well. And the changes that happen mean that mothers have to rethink and reevaluate their lives. And they become tuned into existence in this new way. And this is sort of like an opening of a window at this point. It doesn't mean that this is always going to be open. It's a bit like when Heidegger talks about the call of conscience. We have this moment where we start to see our life in its totality and we start to see the reality of existence. And then we fall back into this everyday mode of being again. So this is very much like this for new parents and particularly mothers, is they start to see life in a different way. Suddenly, their mortality is really important. I hear mothers saying to me, well, I can't die, because what's going to happen to my baby? They also feel that actually their baby is really vulnerable, so that it might die. So death is always part of that early experience. So one of my participants, Helen, talks about being aware of the choices. It's the constant choice making, she says. Every day you're making choices which will affect, like even now, the choice about when to wake him up. So when we think about choice for us, and we, as existential psychotherapists, we always think about, well, freedom and choice and responsibility. And this is what we're trying to encourage our clients to do, aren't they? You need to take responsibility for your choices. Suddenly, here we are making really important choices for another who will have to suffer the consequences. So this suddenly becomes really clear to their mothers that these are really important choices. And this is why there's such a plethora of books on mothering about, what you need to do, what kinds of parenting you need to, because mothers suddenly are thinking, well, I feel really, I don't know what's the best thing to do. I don't know what the consequences of my choices are going to be. And I'm not the one who's going to have to bear the responsibility for those. So also a part of this is about this idea of being at home. And again, there's a real sense that this existential crisis that mothers experience gives them a feeling of Unheimlich, which is Heidegger's idea of being not at home in themselves. Everything has changed, which is really paradoxical, because at the very time where they are trying to create a home and trying to create this sense of safety and security, that they feel most not at home. And it also, as I just said, highlights this choice, freedom, and responsibility. So mothers suddenly realize how vulnerable and dependent their babies are. And I can remember, again, with my daughter, feeling like too scared to put the baby grow on her in case I accidentally pulled an arm off, because she felt so fragile. And although having seen midwives and doctors in the delivery room pulling babies out, I can see that they're a lot more robust than I thought they were at the time. So Parker talks about she is responsible for keeping alive a child and able to fend for itself outside the womb. So mothers are just acutely aware of the responsibility that they hold towards their child. And it's quite interesting about this idea about natality that Alison Stone, a UK philosopher, talks about, that actually natality highlights aspects of our existence in a different way that mortality does. So natality shows us how dependent we are on other people and how vulnerable we are as well. She also talks about how we are, how we inherit things from other people, how we're embedded in social power structures, and how we are situated in our particular context. Yanam talks about, so just going back to Stone. So she was saying that, natality is also about how we move from non-existence. So we've already had a period of non-existence, and then we go into a period of non-existence in death. And so Yalam was talking about life as being this spark between two identical voids, the darkness before birth and the one after death. So we must accept the responsibility to love unconditionally. So one of our graduates at the New School did her research on responsibility. And so she made the point that, just because you have a baby doesn't mean that you automatically take responsibility. You have to choose that. You have to choose to take responsibility, to love unconditionally, to take care of the baby. It's an initial choice. And And then we also have a wider responsibility. And again, my participants were really aware of this, that, you know, they were saying things like, we're creating the next members of society. So there's not only a responsibility that they have to their child, but to a wider society as well. You know, what values are we imparting on our children? What ways of communicating are we giving to our children? We have that responsibility. So Merleau-Ponty on maternal love talks about is created by oath, decision, i.e. promise behavior, but we throw ourselves into it. We end up feeling not only by acting according to the promise, if we do not feel according to the promise, it is because we have not truly decided or promised. So again, he's really highlighting the fact that we have to accept that responsibility for another person. Elizabeth Butterfield is a philosopher who's also written about motherhood, and she says that she talks about how having a child meant that she had created a second heart. For better and for worse, she says, I would never be alone in my cares again. And then she goes on to say, I recognize that a profound commitment had taken root inside of me, and it ran deeper than she'd known before. She'd lost my old self, but in return, it felt like something almost sacred in the self-sacrifice that I felt was required of me as the mother caring for this child. Everything was meaningful in a new way, and I was changed. So although responsibility can feel quite a burden in some way in having to take on the choices for another person, it can also be a really meaningful experience. And it means that mothers change their priorities, their values, and their beliefs. So maternity, I feel, kind of fits in between. It brings natality and mortality together, and it shows our vulnerability, our relationality, and our dependency, but it also highlights our temporality and our facticity. And it also reveals our reciprocity and care. So I'm just going to quickly skip through this because I know I haven't got much time. So anyway, I quite like Heidegger's ideas about care. So he said that that the world matters to us. You know, care is part of our ontological structure, and that we have a moral requirement towards others in terms of our care, and that we can feel guilty if we're not kind of reaching to the others in that way. Simone de Beauvoir had a similar idea. She said, we don't exist in isolation. And she talks very much about this idea of freedom. You know, we kind of think about this absolute freedom that we can just go around doing whatever we want, maybe. And she said, no, we can't. You know, we always must have to think about how it impacts on the other person. That we can, you know, we have to think about our moral obligation to others, that our freedom should not impact on other people. So man is not free to treat other men as things as he likes. So there's always an ethical freedom. So again, I'm just kind of looking at the ethics of care, that care tends to be seen as a gendered response, because women, for whatever, you know, whether it's a societal or whether it's about the maternal role, tend to take on the majority of the caring. Toronto talks about 4 ethical qualities of care: attentiveness, responsibility, competence, and responsiveness. So care brings moral reasoning to everyday living. We've got to think about how we are towards other people. We have an ethical and moral responsibility to other people. So I'm just going to skip over this. So just to kind of conclude about what the maternal power of connection involves. And I think this is not just, you know, kind of related to parenting. I think these are things that we can really think about, that we can use in our everyday lives. So The call of care is elicited when we are confronted by another's vulnerability, most often in parenthood, but not exclusively, is a moral undertaking and acceptance of responsibility towards another. It requires attunement, expert listening, and responding, which is a slow process. And it requires us to also think about ourselves and our choices and the way that we live our lives. And it requires us to reach out to another in connection and understanding, even if it is unequal and unreciprocated. And so just want to finish on love and connection is the bridge to the other. And that's what we need to kind of really hold on to. That we need to try and reach out to people, even when they are against us, maybe, or they're in conflict. We need to try and find those ways of reaching out to other people through love and connection. Thank you for listening.